Take this piece of trash, it's all your loyalty is worth, the lawyer sneered, his voice echoing through the marble halls as he tossed a rotting, slashed canvas at the woman who had served his family for 40 years. Zora stood there, her head bowed, her calloused hands trembling as they gripped the heavy, mold-eaten frame of a portrait that had been discarded in a damp cellar for a decade. The room erupted in cruel laughter, the sound of the plantation owners' silk dresses rustling as they mocked the elderly woman's final inheritance. But they didn't know that behind that ruined canvas lay a secret that would burn their empire to the ground. What was hidden behind that moldy paint? Why did the Baroness leave her most faithful servant a piece of garbage in her final will? Stay with me until the very end, because the truth that Elias and Zora are about to uncover is something no one in the Vale du Paraíba was ever meant to see. Before we dive into this dark mystery of greed and redemption, please give this story a rating from 0 to 10 in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to keep bringing these powerful stories to life, and I truly want to know what you think of this journey. The Vale do Paraíba was a land of beautiful horrors. In the heart of imperial Brazil, the Fazenda Santa Sofia rose like a monument of white stone against the suffocating green of the coffee-covered hills. The air was always thick with the scent of roasting beans, the humidity of the valley, and the silent, heavy weight of 1,000 souls working in the fields. It was a place where the morning mist didn't just bring the cold, it brought a sense of dread that never quite lifted. Elias lived in the shadows of this grandeur. He was a man made of ink and regret. As the estate's bookkeeper, he spent his days in a cramped, windowless office, his fingers permanently stained black from the nibs of his pens. For years, Elias had been the silent witness to the Baron's transactions. He was the one who recorded the costs of horses, the price of coffee sacks, and most painfully, the purchase and sale of human beings. Every name he wrote in his ledger felt like a brand on his own soul. He wasn't always this way. Once, Elias had been a man of books and ideals in Rio de Janeiro, but a mountain of debt had crushed his spirit and sold his life to the plantation. Now his only companion was a bottle of cheap cachaça that sat on his desk, its bitter liquid the only thing that could drown out the faces of those he had helped turn into property. He was a broken man, a ghost in a suit, waiting for a courage he feared he had lost forever. But everything began to change on the day of the unnatural heat. It was the day Dona Margarita's will was to be read. The Baroness had been the iron fist of Santa Sofia, a woman whose beauty had been a mask for a soul as sharp as a razor. Even in death, she seemed to command the room. Her nephew, Dr. Afonso, a lawyer with greedy eyes and a voice like falling gravel, stood at the mahogany table, surrounded by the elite of the valley. Zora was there too. She stood at the very back of the hall, near the servants' entrance. She was a woman of quiet dignity, her back slightly curved like a bow that had been under tension for far too long. For 40 years, she had been the shadow of the Baroness, enduring every whim, every slap, and every secret. Her fingers toyed with a worn rosary made of seeds, a small, humble object that was the only thing she truly owned. And finally, Afonso said, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes, to Zora, for her decades of service, my aunt leaves her personal property, the ruined portrait of the late Baron. A gasp of mockery went through the room. The portrait was a legend of failure at Santa Sofia. It was a massive canvas of the Baron that Dona Margarita had slashed in a fit of rage years ago and thrown into the wine cellar to rot. It was covered in green mold, the wood of the frame was warping from the damp, and the image itself was a nightmare of peeling oil paint. "Go on, old woman," Afonso barked. "Take your treasure, it's exactly what you deserve." Elias, standing in the corner with his ledger under his arm, felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He watched as Zora, with a strength that shouldn't have belonged to her frail frame, dragged the heavy, filthy portrait out of the hall. The laughter of the heirs followed her, like the snapping of whips. They saw it as the ultimate joke, a final insult from a mistress who wanted Zora to own nothing but the image of her master's ruined face. But as Elias looked at Zora's eyes, he didn't see the tears he expected. He saw a sharp, calculating focus. He saw a woman who was looking at that piece of trash as if it were a holy relic. That evening the rain began to fall, a heavy, tropical downpour that turned the roads of the plantation into rivers of red mud. Elias couldn't stay in his office. The image of Zora dragging that frame haunted him, driven by a rare impulse of pity and a strange nagging intuition that he couldn't name. He made his way to the slave quarters. The shack was small and smelled of herbs and old wood. Inside, Zora was not sleeping. She had the portrait propped up against a rickety table, a single tallow candle flickering between them. The light cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. "You shouldn't be here, Senor Elias," Zora said without looking up. Her voice was like the rustling of dry leaves. "I brought some oil," Elias murmured, holding up a small jar. "To help clean the frame. It's a heavy burden for you to carry alone, Zora." He sat on a low stool, and together they began to wipe away the grime of the cellar. The mold came off in thick, grey clumps. As Elias worked on the bottom corner of the frame, his fingers brushed against the back of the canvas. He stopped. "Zora," he whispered, his voice trembling, "feel this." She placed her calloused hand where his had been. The canvas didn't sag like it should have. It didn't feel like a single layer of fabric. Underneath the rotting oil paint, the portrait felt unnaturally thick, almost rigid. It wasn't just a painting, it was a container. "The Baroness was many things," Zora said, her eyes narrowing in the candlelight, "but she was never a fool. She didn't give me this to mock me. She gave it to me because she knew only I would understand why it had to stay hidden. But what could be so important that it was buried under the image of a dead man?" Elias took a small knife from his belt, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. This was the moment where his quiet life ended. If he cut into this canvas and found nothing, he was just a fool in a shack. But if there was something there, he was a conspirator against the most powerful family in the valley. "Do it," Zora commanded, her voice suddenly strong. "Cut the threads, Senor Elias. The truth has been screaming in the dark for too long." With a steady hand, Elias began to slice the secondary backing of the frame. The leather was tough and treated with wax to keep out the moisture of the cellar. As the blade moved, a smell of old parchment and sealing wax filled the small room. And then, something slid out. It wasn't gold. It wasn't jewels. It was a thick bundle of papers, wrapped in silk and stamped with the imperial seal of Brazil. Elias's eyes widened as he recognized the official letterhead. He had spent his life looking at documents like these, but these were different. These were the original deeds to the Santa Sofia lands. But as he turned the pages, his breath caught in his throat. His ink-stained fingers brushed over a signature he knew all too well, the Baron's signature, but written with the shaky hand of a dying man. "My God," Elias whispered, the candle light reflecting in his wide eyes. "Zora, do you know what this is?" "I know what I remember," she replied, her hand clutching her seed rosary so hard her knuckles turned white. "I remember the night the Baron died. I remember the sound of the pen on the paper. I remember the Baroness screaming that it wouldn't happen, and I remember the silence that followed." Elias looked at the document in his hand. It wasn't just a deed. Tucked between the land titles was a collective letter of Alforia, a manumission paper. It was a legal decree, signed and sealed, granting freedom to Zora and 20 other house slaves of Santa Sofia. It was dated the very day the Baron died. The Baroness hadn't just ignored her husband's dying wish. She had stolen the freedom of 20 people and buried the evidence in a ruined portrait, keeping it as a trophy of her own cruelty. And now that document was sitting in the hands of a drunk bookkeeper and an elderly woman in a mud-walled shack. "If Afonso finds out we have this," Elias said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the rain, "he won't just kill us, he'll make sure we disappear before the sun rises." "But he doesn't know," Zora said, leaning forward, her face illuminated by the flame. "He thinks he inherited an empire. He doesn't realize he inherited a cage, and we just found the key." But having the key was only the beginning. The documents were old and the seals were fragile. To make them legal, they had to be registered in the provincial capital, miles away through treacherous mountain trails controlled by Afonso's men. Elias looked at his ink-stained hands. For the first time in years, the black stains didn't look like a mark of shame. They looked like a tool. He was a bookkeeper. He knew the law. He knew the seals. And for the first time in his life, he knew what he had to do. "But this is only the beginning," he muttered, looking at the door, as if he expected the overseers to burst through at any moment. "The Baroness left you this portrait as a final test, Zora. She wanted to see if you were brave enough to claim what was yours." "I have waited 40 years to be brave," Zora replied. "I think that is long enough." But as the wind howled outside, a new shadow appeared at the window. A pair of eyes, cold and calculating, watched the flickering candle from the darkness. The secret of the ruined portrait was no longer a secret, and the hunt was about to begin. What will Elias do now that he holds the freedom of 20 people in his hands? Can a broken man find the strength to face the most powerful family in the empire? The road ahead is filled with blood and betrayal, and the ruined portrait is about to reveal even darker secrets. Stay tuned, because what happens next will change the Vale du Paraíba forever. The silence in the shack was heavier than the rain hammering on the thatched roof. Elias stared at the yellowed parchment in his hand, the ink-stained tips of his fingers trembling against the imperial seal. It wasn't just paper, it was the weight of 20 lives, 20 souls that had been legally free for years, yet kept in chains by the spite of a dead woman. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. Every time he had recorded a punishment in the plantation ledgers, every time he had calculated the cost of their meager rations, he had been participating in a massive, prolonged crime. "They aren't just slaves, Zora," Elias whispered, his voice cracking as he looked at the elderly woman. "By the law of the Emperor, you have been free since the moment the Baron drew his last breath. This document, it's a manumission, a collective alphoria." Zora didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She simply reached out and touched the corner of the paper, her thumb tracing the Baron's shaky signature. Her eyes, clouded by age, but sharp with a sudden, piercing clarity, met his. "I knew it," she said, her voice a low vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. "I heard the scratch of the pen that night. I heard the Baroness's breath hitch when she realized what he was doing. She thought that by hiding it in that ugly slashed portrait, she could bury the truth forever. She wanted me to have it because she wanted me to know I was almost free and that she had taken it away." But there was something else. As Elias turned the pages of the bundle, his heart skipped a beat. Beneath the manumission papers were the original land deeds of Santa Sofia. He had seen the copies in the main house's safe, but these were different. These documents bore the marks of a previous owner, a community of freedmen and small farmers who had held this land before the Baron's surveyors arrived with their measuring chains and their guns. The entire foundation of the Fazenda Santa Sofia was built on a lie. The Baron hadn't just bought this land, he had stolen it, and the Baroness had kept the proof hidden behind her husband's ruined image as a final, twisted insurance policy. If the family ever lost their grip on power, she could have used these papers to burn the legacy down herself. But now, they were in the hands of the two people she despised most. "We have to hide this," Elias said, his eyes darting to the small window. "If Afonso finds out, he won't just burn the shack. He'll burn everything to make sure this never sees the light of day. You have to understand, Zora, this isn't just about your freedom anymore. This is about the land. This is about a crime that could ruin the elite of the entire valley." But Elias was a man of ledgers and ink, not of action. His first instinct was to run, to bury the papers again and pretend he had never seen them. He felt the cold sweat on his neck. He thought of the bottle of cachaça waiting for him in his office, the only thing that usually made the world stop spinning. But then he looked at Zora's hands, those calloused, steady hands that had served a monster for 4 decades without breaking. "Do you know what Afonso is planning?" Zora asked, her voice pulling him back from the edge of his panic. "He's been talking to the trader from Rio. He says the old stock is a drain on the plantation's profits. He's going to sell us, Senor Elias. He's going to sell me and Juvencio and Maria. We're to be sent to the mines or the city ports, so by next week we'll be gone." The news was a bucket of ice water over Elias's head. The clock was already ticking. Afonso wasn't just a greedy heir, he was a man in a hurry to settle his debts. And he didn't care who he broke in the process. He had no idea that the ruined portrait he had tossed away as a joke was actually the only thing that could save the people he was about to sell, but Elias knew that a bookkeeper's word meant nothing against a lawyer's title. He needed more. He needed to verify these seals, and he needed a way to get them to the provincial capital without being caught. "There's a man," Elias murmured, more to himself than to Zora. "Old Father Bernardo, at the small chapel in the forest. He used to be the Baron's confessor. He might know if these papers were ever officially witnessed before they were hidden." "But the road is watched," Zora warned. "Afonso's overseers are like dogs on a scent. They see everything." "Not everything," Elias replied, a flicker of his old idealistic self sparking in his chest. "They don't see the man they think is a harmless drunk. They don't see the man who spends his nights staring at columns of numbers. I'll go tonight, under the cover of the rain." As Elias prepared to leave the shack, he felt a strange sensation. The grey shadow that had lived in his soul for years seemed to be shifting. He wasn't just a witness anymore, he was a participant. But as he stepped out into the mud in the dark, he didn't see the figure crouching behind the large water barrel near the kitchen. He didn't see the glint of a metal button in the moonlight. The next morning, the atmosphere at the Casa Grande was suffocating. Dr. Afonso was in the Baron's old study, surrounded by the scent of expensive tobacco and the rustle of maps. He was a man who looked like he was carved out of cold marble, perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, and utterly heartless. He looked up as Elias entered, his eyes scanning the bookkeeper with a predator's intensity. "You look tired, Elias," Afonso said, his voice smooth and dangerous. "Did the storm keep you awake? Or was it the burden of your, extracurricular visits?" Elias felt his heart stop. He gripped his ledger tightly, his knuckles turning white. "I was merely checking the supplies in the lower quarters, Doctor. The rain can be hard on the grain stores." "The grain stores?" Afonso repeated, a thin, cruel smile touching his lips. "Of course, it's good to see such dedication. But don't let your dedication cloud your judgment. I've noticed you've been spending quite a bit of time with that old woman, Zora, the one with the ruined portrait. It would be a shame if I had to move her sale date forward. She seems to be a distraction." It was a warning, a direct hit. Elias realized then that he was being watched. Every move he made was being reported back to the man who held his life in his hands. But Afonso didn't know about the papers. Not yet. He only knew that something was happening, and he was the kind of man who crushed things he didn't understand. Elias spent the day in a fog of fear, but he didn't stop. He used his access to the estate's archives to look for any mention of the freedmen's community. He found nothing in the official books, but in an old discarded diary of the Baroness, he found a single line that chilled him to the bone. "The forest people have been cleared. The silence is finally ours." The forest people, the original owners of the land. As the sun began to set, casting long bloody shadows across the coffee fields, Elias knew he couldn't wait any longer. He had to reach Father Bernardo. He slipped out of the side gate, avoiding the main trails, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He carried the documents wrapped in oilcloth, tucked deep inside his coat, right next to his heart. But as he reached the edge of the dense forest, a voice called out from the trees, "Going somewhere, Senor Bookkeeper?" Elias froze. Emerging from the shadows was the head overseer, a man named Tiao, whose cruelty was a legend in the valley. He was holding a heavy whip, and his eyes were full of a dark, twisted amusement. Behind him stood two other men, their faces obscured by the mist. "Dr. Afonso doesn't like it when his people wander," Tiao said, taking a step forward. "He thinks you might be carrying something that doesn't belong to you, something valuable." Elias backed away, his boots slipping in the mud. He was trapped. The forest was thick, the trail was blocked, and the truth he carried was about to be snuffed out before it could even begin to burn. But just as Tiao raised his whip, a sudden sharp whistle echoed through the trees. A stone flew out of the darkness, hitting Tiao square in the forehead. He grunted and fell to his knees. Out of the shadows stepped a group of men Elias had never seen before, men with hard faces and eyes that held the fire of the forest. They weren't slaves from the plantation. They were the descendants of the forest people, the ones who had been watching Santa Sofia for decades, waiting for the moment the lie would finally break. "Run, Senor Elias," one of the men said, his voice a low growl. "Go to the father. We will handle the dogs." Elias didn't wait. He plunged into the woods, the sound of the struggle fading behind him. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs felt like lead. He reached the small, crumbling chapel just as the moon was at its peak. Father Bernardo was an old man, his skin like wrinkled parchment. He looked at the documents Elias presented, and then he looked at the bookkeeper. He didn't seem surprised. He seemed relieved. "I have been waiting for these papers for 20 years, the priest whispered, crossing himself. "The Baron was a man of many sins, but in his final hour, he tried to do one right thing. The Baroness, she threatened to burn the chapel down if I ever spoke of it. She said she would make sure I was buried in an unmarked grave." "Is it real, Father?" Elias asked, his voice trembling. "Is it enough to stop Afonso?" "It is real," the priest said, his eyes tearing up. "But the law in this valley is a twisted thing. To win, you must not only have the truth, you must have the courage to present it where the whole world can see it. You must take this to the auction, Elias. You must stand before the magistrate and the traders and the families of the Vale. You must shame them into justice." But the auction was only 3 days away, and between the chapel and the courtyard of Santa Sofia lay a valley filled with Afonso's men, a path slick with betrayal, and a secret that was already beginning to leak. Elias looked at the ruined documents. He thought of Zora, waiting in her shack, holding her seed rosary. He thought of his own life, a life spent writing names in a book of misery. For the first time, he didn't want the cachaça. He wanted the light. "I'll do it," Elias said, his voice steady for the first time in his life. "I'll stand before them all." But as he left the chapel, he saw the orange glow of fire in the distance. It was coming from the direction of the plantation. The shack. Zora. What has Afonso done? Is Elias too late to save the woman who gave him his soul back? The battle for Santa Sofia is no longer in the shadows. It's about to explode into the light of day. Stay with me, because the next chapter will reveal a betrayal that goes deeper than anyone ever imagined. The smell of burning thatch and old wood hit Elias before he even cleared the tree line. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm that matched his stumbling footsteps. The orange glow against the night sky wasn't just a fire, it was a beacon of Afonso's desperation. Elias didn't care about his own safety anymore. He didn't care about the mud soaking his clothes or the thorns tearing at his skin. He only cared about the woman who had lived through 40 years of hell only to have her hope turned into ash. "Zora!" he screamed, his voice swallowed by the roar of the flames as he reached the clearing. The shack was a skeleton of fire. The roof had already collapsed, sending a fountain of sparks into the humid air. But as Elias moved closer, his eyes searching the chaos, he realized something that made his blood run cold. There were no cries for help. There was no one trying to throw water on the blaze. The other workers stood in a silent, terrified semicircle, their faces illuminated by the destruction of the only home Zora had known. "Where is she?" Elias grabbed the arm of a young man standing near the edge of the crowd. "Where is Zora?" "They took her, Senor," the boy whispered, his eyes wide with a terror that went deeper than the fire. "Tiao and the others. They dragged her to the big house before they lit the torch. Dr. Afonso said, he said the portrait was cursed and had to be destroyed. But that was just the beginning of the nightmare." Elias looked into the heart of the fire and saw the charred remains of the heavy wooden frame. The ruined portrait was gone, turned into blackened embers. Afonso thought he had won. He thought that by burning the canvas, he had burned the evidence. He didn't know that the real power, the imperial documents, were currently pressed against Elias's chest, protected by oilcloth and the bookkeeper's own trembling body. "He thinks he's erased the past," Elias muttered, his fingers clutching the papers through his coat. "But he's only set the future on fire." Elias knew he couldn't go back to his office. He was a fugitive now, but he couldn't leave the plantation without Zora. He retreated into the shadows of the coffee groves, his mind racing. He needed an ally, someone inside the Casa Grande who knew the layout of the cellars where they likely held the troublemakers before a sale. He thought of Benedita, the head cook. She had been at Santa Sofia as long as Zora, a woman who saw everything through the steam of her copper pots, but said very little. If anyone knew where Afonso was hiding the elderly woman, it was her. Sneaking toward the back of the grand house was like walking into the jaws of a trap. The windows were ablaze with light, and the sounds of laughter and clinking crystal floated down from the dining room. Afonso was celebrating. He was entertaining the local landowners, the very men he intended to sell Zora and the others to. Elias slipped into the kitchen, the scent of roasting meat and spices momentarily masking the smell of smoke. Benedita was alone, her face weary as she stirred a massive pot. She didn't even look up when he entered. "You're a dead man if Tiao finds you here, Elias," she said, her voice heavy with warning. "I need to find Zora, Benedita. They're going to sell her tomorrow, aren't they? Not in 3 days." The cook stopped stirring. She looked at him, her eyes dark and searching. "Afonso moved the auction up. He's afraid, Elias. I've never seen a man with so much money look so scared. He has her in the old salt cellar under the north wing. He's going to put her on the block at dawn along with the others. He wants them gone before the magistrate arrives for the weekly circuit." "But the magistrate is already here," Elias whispered, a plan forming in the dark corners of his mind. "He's upstairs, isn't he, eating Afonso's beef and drinking his wine?" "He is," Benedita replied, "and he's as bought and paid for as the rest of them. You think a few papers will change that? This is the veil, Elias. The law here is written in coffee and blood." "Then we change the audience," Elias said, his voice gaining a strength he didn't know he possessed. "We don't just show the magistrate, we show the whole valley. We show the traders, the neighbors, the workers. We make the truth so loud that even a bought judge can't pretend he's deaf." But as he turned to leave, Benedita grabbed his hand. "Wait, there is something else you should know. In the Baroness's private ledger, the one she kept in her jewelry box, there was a name that didn't belong to a slave or a creditor. It was the name of a child the Baron had with a woman from the forest community years before he built this house." Elias felt a jolt of electricity run through him. "What was the name?" "Elias," she whispered. The room seemed to tilt. The name he had carried his whole life, a name he thought his mother had chosen out of thin air in a Rio slum, was written in the blood-soaked history of Santa Sofia. The debt that had brought him here, the coincidence of his employment, the strange pull he felt toward the land. It wasn't a tragedy, it was a homecoming. "I'm not just the bookkeeper," Elias breathed, the realization shattering the last of his fear. "I'm the evidence." But he didn't have time to process the shock. The sound of heavy boots echoed in the hallway outside the kitchen. Tiao. The overseer hadn't stayed at the chapel. He had come back, and he was looking for blood. "Hide!" Benedita hissed, pointing toward the pantry. Elias ducked behind a stack of flour sacks just as the door swung open. Tiao entered, his face bruised and his eyes wild with rage. He looked at Benedita, his hand resting on the hilt of his machete. "Where is he?" Tiao growled. "The drunk. We found his tracks leading back from the woods. We know he didn't die in the chapel." "I haven't seen anyone but the ghosts of this house," Benedita replied, her voice cool and steady. "Why don't you check the cellar? Maybe he's down there trying to talk to the old woman." Tiao spat on the floor and turned, heading back into the hallway. Elias waited until the sound of his footsteps faded before stepping out from behind the sacks. He looked at Benedita, a silent thank you in his eyes. "Go," she said. "The sun will be up in 3 hours. If you aren't on that courtyard with those papers, Zora is as good as dead." Elias didn't run into the woods this time. He moved through the shadows of the house, heading toward the north wing. He had 3 hours to find a way into the salt cellar, 3 hours to prepare for the confrontation of his life, and 3 hours to prove that the ruined legacy of Santa Sofia was finally coming to an end. But as he reached the heavy oak door that led to the cellars, he found it wasn't locked. It was standing slightly ajar, and from the darkness below, he heard a sound that chilled him to his core, the sound of Zora singing. It wasn't a song of sorrow, it was a song of war. What will Elias find in the darkness of the salt cellar? And what is the secret of his own birth that the Baroness tried to bury along with the deeds? The auction is about to begin, and the price of freedom has never been higher. Stay with me. because the next part of this story will change everything you thought you knew about the Fazenda Santa Sofia. The stairs groaned under Elias's weight, each step sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive silence of the north wing. The air down here was different, cold, sharp and biting with the smell of salt and ancient dampness. It was the place where the plantation's wealth was preserved and where its troublemakers were broken. As he reached the bottom, the flickering light of his stolen candle revealed a row of heavy iron bars. "Zora," he whispered, his breath hitching as he saw her. She was sitting on a stone bench, her back against the weeping wall. She looked smaller than she had in the shack, her white hair glowing like a halo in the dark. But she wasn't weeping. She was humming that low, rhythmic tune, her fingers moving rhythmically as if she were still holding her seed rosary, though the overseers had surely taken it from her. "I knew you would come, Elias," she said, her voice steady and devoid of fear. "But you are carrying more than just papers now. I can see it in your eyes. You've spoken to Benedita." Elias knelt by the bars, the oilcloth bundle pressed against his chest. "She told me, Zora. She told me about the name in the Baroness's ledger. Why didn't you tell me? Why let me live as a ghost for so long?" "Because a ghost is harder to kill than a man," Zora replied, reaching through the bars to touch his ink-stained hand. "The Baroness kept you here to punish the Baron's memory. She wanted his blood to be the one recording the misery of his empire. But she made a mistake. She gave the bookkeeper a heart. But there was no time for the weight of the past to settle." Above them, the heavy thud of boots began to shake the ceiling. The house was waking up. The sun was beginning to bleed over the mountains of the Vale, and the auction was no longer a threat. It was a reality. "I can't get you out of here, Zora," Elias said, his voice trembling with frustration as he tugged at the massive padlock. "The key is with Tiao or Afonso himself." "Then don't," Zora said, her eyes burning with a fierce light. "Go to the courtyard. If you free me here, Afonso will just claim you stole me. But if you free me there, in front of the world, he can never take it back. Take the papers, Elias. Stand where the coffee is sold and tell them that the master of Santa Sofia has been dead for 20 years, and the new master is the truth. But they'll kill me before I can speak," Elias argued. "Not if you use the one thing Afonso fears more than the law," Zora whispered. "His own greed. He needs those traders to believe this land is his. If you cast a shadow on his title, the money will stop. And in this valley, when the money stops, the power dies." Elias stood up, the grey shadow in his soul finally burning away. He wasn't the broken clerk from Rio anymore. He was the son of the forest and the master of the ledger. But as he turned to leave, the cellar door at the top of the stairs slammed open with a violence that echoed through the stone chambers. "A touching scene," Dr. Afonso's voice drifted down, dripping with a cold, lawyerly venom. He descended slowly, followed by Tiao, who was holding a heavy lantern that cast monstrous shadows on the walls. Afonso looked immaculate in his black suit, but his face was tight, his eyes darting to the oilcloth bundle Elias was trying to hide. "I should have known," Afonso said, stopping a few feet away. "The drunkard and the servant, plotting in the dark. Give me the papers, Elias. I know you took them from the portrait before it burned. Give them to me, and I might let you leave this valley alive." "They aren't mine to give, Doctor," Elias said, stepping in front of Zora's cell. "They belong to the people you're planning to sell, and the land belongs to the families you murdered to build this house." Afonso laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Murder? Those are strong words for a man who has spent 10 years recording my family's crimes for a salary of cheap liquor. You think anyone will listen to you? You're a debtor, a failure, a non-entity." "Maybe," Elias replied, his voice growing dangerously calm. "But even a non-entity can sign a deposition, and Father Bernardo has already seen these. The forest people are waiting, Afonso. They've been waiting a long time." Afonso's smile faltered. He looked at Tiao and gave a short, sharp nod. The overseer stepped forward, his massive hand reaching for Elias's throat. But what Afonso didn't realize was that a man who has already lost everything is the most dangerous man in the world. Elias didn't run. He didn't cower. As Tiao lunged, Elias swung his heavy ledger, the book of misery he had carried for years, hitting the overseer across the temple with the weight of 1,000 recorded sins. Tiao stumbled, the lantern falling and shattering on the stone floor. For a moment, the cellar was plunged into a chaotic dance of fire and shadow. "Run!" Zora screamed. Elias didn't look back. He scrambled past the dazed overseer and raced up the stairs, the sound of Afonso's furious orders following him like a curse. He burst out of the north wing and into the cool air of the dawn. The courtyard was already transformed. A wooden platform had been erected in the center, and the smell of roasting coffee was being replaced by the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. A line of workers, chained at the wrists, was being led toward the block. Among them were faces Elias had known for a decade: Maria Juvencio, the young boy from the fire. And at the edge of the clearing, the first of the carriages were arriving. The elite of the Vale were coming for their bargains. Elias looked at the bundle in his hand. He had the truth, but he was alone, and the most powerful man in the valley was right behind him. But he had to choose. He could disappear into the mountains and save himself, or he could step onto that platform and risk everything for a woman who had given him the only inheritance that mattered, his dignity. Would Elias make it to the platform before Afonso caught him? And what will the elite of the Vale do when they realize their wealth is built on a stolen legacy? The final confrontation is minutes away, and the air is thick with the scent of a coming storm. Stay with me for the conclusion of the story, because what happens next is a moment of justice that the Vale do Paraíba will never forget. Elias burst onto the auction platform just as the hammer was about to fall on Zora's life. "Stop this madness!" he roared, his voice echoing across the silent, shocked courtyard. He held the oilcloth bundle high, the imperial seals glinting in the morning sun. "Doctor," Afonso reached the edge of the crowd, his face twisted in a mask of fury. But the magistrate, sensing the sudden shift in the air, stepped forward to intervene. As Elias presented the original deeds and the collective manumission papers, the silence of the elite turned into a murmur of scandal. The evidence was undeniable. The Baron's dying signature, witnessed by Father Bernardo, stripped Afonso of his inheritance and granted freedom to the very people he tried to sell. The ruined portrait had delivered its final devastating blow. Afonso was led away in disgrace, his empire of lies crumbling into the red dust of the Vale. Months later, the Fazenda Santa Sofia was a place of shadows no more. The land was returned to the forest community, and Zora, finally free, stood on the veranda where she once served coffee as a shadow. Elias remained by her side, no longer a bookkeeper of misery, but a man using his ink to write a new history of dignity. In the center of the courtyard, they built a communal bonfire. As the flames consumed the last remains of the Baron's ruined portrait, the smoke rose into the clear mountain air. Justice had been a slow-moving river, but it had finally carved its path through the stone. If you were moved by Elias and Zora's journey from the shadows into the light, please subscribe to the channel to support our work. I would love to hear your thoughts. Give this story a rating from 0 to 10 in the comments. We'll be here waiting for you with a new story very soon.